Hello there, and welcome to the next edition of the Southwest District Alumni Association's For Greater Professionals program. My name is Connor Terry, and I will give you an introduction to myself here on the next slide. But I have been asked here to talk to you about networking in the workplace. And before I begin, I think it's really important to note that this presentation is highly tailored towards empowering graduating seniors. But I think that there is some lessons to be learned for professionals who are young and old on how are emerging professionals networking? What are the needs of some of these students and some of these new professionals? And how can you tailor your programs or your services that you provide to meet the needs of these individuals? So as I mentioned, my name is Connor Terry. I am a life member of the Alpha Chapter of Kappa Kappa Psi at Oklahoma State University, and I am the current Communications Director of the Southwest District Alumni Association. So if you have received any emails from me in the past, this is who that name is. But also, if you are wanting to join the Southwest District Alumni Association, please feel free to send me an email or to find me on Facebook. I'd love to talk to you about the Alumni Association. And lastly, I just graduated with my master's degree in educational leadership studies with an option in college student development. So essentially, I'm going to be working at a college or university setting, hopefully in student services. So I'm very excited about that and what the future holds. So I think that it's really important that when we're doing a presentation to give a brief overview of what you're going to see. At the very beginning, we're going to be talking a little bit about what networking is and why networking is so important. And then in the second through fourth areas, we're really going to be talking about three core ways for you to network. These are the three easiest ways for you to find those professional networking opportunities, to find individuals that align with your career goals or your career aspirations, and also just practice, which I also think is very important. And then on the last step right there on number 5, we're going to be talking about tips and tricks. So what are some things that you can do to really grow and to do well in the networking scene? So introduction, what is networking? I think that this is a question that we are often faced with, and we don't necessarily always know the answer to this question. It's not something that's really covered in our studies. It's not something that we really often practice unless we go to a career services site at our institution, or perhaps if this is something that is highly important to our employers. We don't really learn how to network. But according to the dictionary, the technical definition of networking is the action or process of interacting with others to exchange information and develop professional or social contacts. So this is really important because when we're looking at a ever-shrinking world, I think that the phrase I hear very often with my students is that they have found that it's not about how much they know, it's about who they know. And while I want to say that that's not always the case, I think that it's very important because sometimes when you know people who work at the industries or the companies that you want to work for or who do a very similar job, they can serve as a very important role model, a very important mentor, and a very important information accrual system for you to succeed. And I think that that's why networking is so important, because it's not always just about networking for the sake of a job. It's about networking for the sake of growing, for learning new information, for finding out ways that you can do things differently, for finding ways where perhaps there is a company who is launching a brand new software system that's going to be very, very influential for the company that you're about to start a job in. And because of that network, you might be able to connect that social or that software system back over to the new company that you're going to work at. So social media, this is a big thing, especially amongst younger individuals. Our friends who are just graduating from college are a big social media heavy generation. And when we're looking at social media, I threw in email here as well, because this is a very easy and important contact method for millennials as well. It is the most used contact method amongst young people today. And I think that, especially when I went around and I was asking people about how do they prefer to be contacted, the number one thing that they didn't say was by phone. The second biggest way that they didn't want to be contacted was face to face. They didn't want to come into an office and have to sit down and have a conversation. They wanted to be able to try and do it electronically so that they could do it autonomously, so they could do it by themselves. So when we're looking at millennials, 1 in 5 millennials use social media to connect with individuals that they didn't know and to learn something about them. That's really important because when we're looking at, like as I mentioned earlier, that ever shrinking world, this is the number one way in which millennials are finding people. This is the number one way in which they're finding people who are going to serve as mentors, are going to serve as role models, who could potentially end up being future employers down the line. So it's really important that you aren't afraid to be contacted by individuals, especially if someone has a question, if someone is really confused and wants to get to know more about your industry or your company or your field. But also to make sure that you stay connected with those individuals. And that's something that's a little bit of a note for our younger friends as well, is that we really want to make sure that we're not just contacting people for information, that we're creating that shared network with people so that it's continuously happening. It's kind of like a feedback loop where you start the initial exchange and eventually you're just going to continue that relationship with that information exchange. It's not just a transaction, it's an exchange. And I think that the last thing that is potentially the most important for our young friends to hear is the fact that always be your best self and always remember that what you put out into the world stays out there, even if you delete it. This is something that I think that a lot of my students specifically have really struggled with and have really had to learn the hard way, because they think that they could just put out pictures of themselves that may not be the best representation of who they are. They say some things which we've seen a lot in the past couple of years, of people digging up past social media posts to show them as being one certain way when they've actually grown and developed past that. So just be aware, be smart. I'm not saying put out things that are incorrect or that are false. I'm just saying make sure that you're thinking about, if I put this out there, if an employer saw this, could this get me in trouble? Or could this be a reason why I'm not hired for a job? The second topic is those conferences. Now, I'm sure that not all of us have been able to attend a conference for our profession, but if you have, that is amazing and that's great for you. But there's also a really cool thing with a lot of companies or potential employers out there who have an opportunity for you to have professional development funding. This is not the case with every profession. Sometimes some professions or some companies cannot afford these sorts of opportunities, and it would be up to the employee to essentially pay for these conferences or for these opportunities. The reason why I mentioned conferences and I added them into this presentation is because it's one of the best places to make professional connections. I have been to many different conventions in my lifetime. I would say I have been to an LGBT college conference. I have been to the national conference for the past 2 years for my profession. Obviously, I have been to many of the Southwest District conventions and 2 national conventions, with my third one coming up here in July. And because of all of these conferences, I have made so many connections across the country with people who work in my field of work, who work outside of my field of work, who also challenge me. And sometimes I have to use their advice or use their input to figure out how they might approach the situations that I'm in. And at the end of the day, it has really helped me create a sense of community. That if I hadn't have gone to these conferences and I hadn't have networked at these organizations, I wouldn't know all the amazing things that I know today. Now, most conferences will have a networking session built into them. Usually it's not formally labeled as a networking session. They usually will come up with interesting sorts of phrases or titles for these sorts of sessions. Sometimes it's a browse session, sometimes it's a resource fair, but these are great things that you should always take the opportunity to explore. They usually will bring in both organizations or individuals or companies that have very important products to give you. That doesn't mean that necessarily you have to buy what they're selling, but it's a good way for you to interact with people within your profession, to ask questions, to gain their insights, to figure out how did they get into what they're doing. Maybe to talk about this great product that they have that's available for you, that maybe because you're networking back and forth with them, maybe you're going to be able to, like I mentioned earlier, pull that resource back into the profession that you're currently in. And the last thing that I really want to talk about are these tips here for conferences, because I know that not everyone has had the chance to attend a conference before, or maybe that there's a conference upcoming. I want to make sure that you are all prepared. One of the biggest recommendations that I can make for you is to always bring business cards. And this is just a really good idea because what you can end up doing is exchange information really quickly with individuals that you talk to. You can get business cards from the individuals that you talk to as well so that you know how you can contact them later. But also you can write down what conversations you had with that individual. So for example, when I'm at a conference and I have a conversation with someone, I will exchange business cards with them and say that I will follow up with them after the conference. And on the back of the business card, I will write down that we talked about this, this, and this. So that when I go home, number one, I don't forget, but number two, I remember the exact conversation I had with that individual. The other thing is make sure that you're being as social as you're comfortable being. Don't try to force yourself to network with numerous people. Don't try to go out of your way and network with a giant group of people. If you're more comfortable doing a one-on-one conversation, make sure that that's the situation that you're in, okay? If you're uncomfortable with the situation or you feel like you need to dismiss yourself, please do that. It is okay to do that. And the last thing is, if you're an introvert or you're a little shy, or perhaps you're at a conference by yourself, make sure that you show up to things early because then it's so much easier for you to make a connection or to create a friendship with someone at the conference because there's less people around. So yes, that does mean that you have less options of individuals to talk to, but it makes conversation a little bit more natural than you trying to approach a large crowd of people on your own. Speaking of large groups of people, here we have our professional organizations. I do want to make reference to the fact that I know that not everyone has a professional organization. If you don't have an organization, that is okay. There are still some very important information I think that you can learn from here. Potentially you can use some of this information and apply it to national convention, for example. Or you can apply this information to an organization that represents a passion or a hobby of yours. It doesn't necessarily have to be within a professional outlook. But participating in a professional organization is a really great way to network. It's a great way to also build friendships within a field, within a passion, within a hobby. It's also a great way to find future employers. It's a really great way to find out new practices, find out things that are upcoming in your field. So if there's a new technique that's coming out, if there is a research article or research publication from that national organization, that might be something that you are provided by the organization. It's just a really great opportunity for you to get that information. I know that once you graduate from college, you kind of think that your journey from achieving information is over, but unfortunately that is just not the case. We are always learning, we are always going to be learning, and so this is a great opportunity for you to really connect with that continuing education piece that you won't get out in the real world. So if you are not aware of what organizations exist in your field, you can always Google your profession and just put professional organization right behind it. On average, I would say that usually 1 to 4 groups or organizations will likely show up. If you are looking for something much more specific than just, say, for example, biochemistry professional organization, and you're looking for a very specific type of chemical or chemical subgroup, you can always add that in as well. Or just browse through the listings and see if there's something that pops up for you. And this is a really great way for you to find some of those conventions and conferences that we talked about on the earlier slide. In addition to that, it's a great way to discover volunteer work within your profession. It's going to really help you to grow. And it's also going to be a great way for you to figure out about those professional development opportunities. So maybe there is a great job out there that is posted at or within that organization or potentially at that conference that you can learn about only because you are a part of that organization. Maybe there's going to be some of that volunteer work that's going to challenge you to grow as a leader, to grow as a professional, to grow as a thinker, as a scholar. And in addition to that, maybe it's going to provide you that opportunity to give all of that growth back to the people who don't have that growth or don't have that understanding that you have gained if you are an older professional, but you can teach them through those presentations. And lastly, I really want to spend the most time covering some of my tips and tricks. Like I mentioned, these are some of the things that I have learned over the past couple of years that have really helped me to be successful. Being in a networking situation isn't always the easiest thing because sometimes they can be scary. Sometimes if you're a little bit more introverted, it could be not the most fun experience, but there are ways to make sure that you're having a good time or make sure that the networking process is not scary if you do it right. I think one of the ways that you can really help yourself out here is to make sure that you always have your elevator speech prepared. And what I mean by an elevator speech is really talking about who are you, what do you do or what do you want to do, and why are you having a conversation with this person? So for example, if I was going to give an elevator speech to someone in my profession, I would usually go up and say, hello, so my name is Connor Terry. I am an employee at Oklahoma State University, so I work specifically with student organizations on campus. And I noticed that you also work at an institution that has a campus labs program. What challenges do you face with using that interface? So that way you're opening up the conversation and you're posing to them a question so that they have something to respond back to you with. It makes the conversation flow a little bit easier than if you just go up and say, hi, my name is Connor Terry, who are you? In addition to having that elevator speech prepared, make sure that you're not taking up too much of their time. Make sure you're letting them speak. And I think that that's a really important way that you can ensure that that happens, is to ask that question at the very end. That's a very purposeful question. I have found that a lot of individuals, when they are networking, will make the networking process all about them. And they will just sort of talk and not provide the opportunity for the other individual to provide information back to them. And it's really important when we're talking about networking to remember that it's about exchanging of information, not a one-way transaction. So we want to make sure that we are allowing other people to speak as much as we are allowing ourselves to be heard. If you want to establish some rapport with that individual, so maybe that your networking session has gone well, or perhaps there is additional information that you want to get from this individual, make sure that you always create a reason to follow up. And I think that this is a great way to put that business card method into effect here, is to say, well, here's my contact information, and I'm going to be reaching out to you in the next couple of days to find out more about whatever. Because that way you obviously have some sort of connection back to that individual. You also are going to have some sort of reason for contacting the individual in the future. And then once, maybe a week or 2 weeks out, that individual is going to be expecting communication from you, so that your communication is more likely to be received than if you just randomly email them and ask them a question. I think another piece that's really important is when you're networking, never ask for a job. That is the number one thing that current professionals or potential employers do not want to hear. They do not want to hear that someone only came up to talk to them and to approach them because of the fact that there is a position open at their office or at their career site or at their institution, and that individual wants that job. Instead, what you could be talking about is you can gain information from that individual about the workplace and use that information in the job search. So specifically, if there's a job open at this company and you're talking to the branch manager, for example, get information from that individual about what is he or she doing in their branch that is being successful, that they think is standing out or is the most important to them, so that you can use a lot of this information when and if you apply for that job later on. And the last thing that's really, really important is to always know that practice makes perfect. I think that there is a lot of individuals out there who just think that they're naturally good at networking because they can just be the most social individual, which in fairness would be an accurate statement. However, you need to make sure that you're networking with a purpose. Because networking, like I mentioned, and I have mentioned many times, is about information exchanging. It's not about just communicating. It's not about just finding someone that you like and have a lot in common with. It's about exchanging of information for the mutual benefit of everyone involved. So sometimes that means that you need to practice. Sometimes that means that you need to sit down and say, how am I going to do this? How would I approach this situation? And maybe you're going to take advantage of some of the networking opportunities that exist on your campus or that exist within your profession or your current workspace to practice those. Maybe you can call up a friend who works in that profession currently. Maybe you can call up that friend who is a mentor or is a role model and say, hey, would you mind pretending to be someone I don't know, and I'm going to come in and try to network with you and do X, Y, and Z. The more that you practice, the better you're going to get at it, and the better you get at it, the more likely you are to create meaningful relationships and networks with individuals. And lastly, this is my information. So obviously when I'm doing a presentation that's all about networking, I have to throw out my information. I would be more than happy to answer any of your questions. I know that this is a very rudimentary presentation because I am not necessarily an expert at networking, but I am more than happy to put out some feelers to try and understand if I can get an answer for your question. If you want to have a conversation about how to do an elevator speech or where you can obtain business cards, I'd be more than happy to talk to you about all of these things because I know that it took me a while to figure out the things that I told you about, and I only learned it because I asked questions myself. But I hope that you have a lot of fun learning how to network. I hope that you have a successful career ahead of you. And I hope that potentially we will see some of you involved in SWADA moving forward in the next upcoming year.